May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So first, let me say it's wonderful to be back here with you. I love being here so much. And Catherine and I had a marvelous couple of weeks away that was restorative and rejuvenating. And actually, we visited family and some dear, dear old friends from my early childhood and reflected on sort of our whole lives. And that was very meaningful. But it meant not that I wanted to do that forever, but that I was ready to be back here more deeply, more fully, with greater joy. So anyway, thanks for showing up with me this morning. It's nice to be together. That all being the case, nevertheless, one of these days, I'm going to die. You will too. And all the people who heard Jesus say, "Whoever eats this bread will live forever," I don't say this cynically, it's just an observation, but they all died too. It's not because they didn't believe Jesus. I don't think Jesus was speaking literally. I certainly don't take this passage literally. But I must say it has caused me to reflect on my own relationship to food. And I'm going to tell you about it, but I'm reluctant to do so for one very particular reason. I'm going to tell you about something that's pretty personal. But that's not what makes me reluctant. I got over being reluctant about talking about personal things a long time ago. But I am worried that listening to me talk about my difficult relationship with food, you may find that you have some good advice to give me, which maybe I would be grateful to hear, at least at some point. But right now, you may get so excited about having good advice that you can share with me that would be helpful to me that you'll get distracted from doing your own personal reflecting. Let me give you a gift. Don't worry about me for a few minutes. Just let me be a window for you to look through, maybe into your own life. Later, we can come back to it, but for now, just receive the gift of some reflection to reflect on. For my whole life until recently, I have had easy, uncomplicated feelings about food. I liked most things people put in front of me, and I was always willing to eat anything anybody put in front of me because they thought it was good enough to give to me and I wanted to honor them. I mean, I'd eat anything. And it was fine. I might not like the taste of it particularly in some few cases, but mostly I liked anything I ate. And those few cases, as I said, I ate them anyway because somebody gave it to me. I didn't have to struggle with gaining weight. I could eat sort of as much sweets as I wanted to, and it didn't make a difference. There weren't any foods that made me feel nauseous. Just in the last few years, I have finally begun to realize that I had been putting up with and downplaying some digestive difficulties, such as lactose intolerance, and they were getting worse. 3 years ago, which coincidentally is the last time we had these readings about bread for all of August. If you've been here in church the last 3 Sundays, it's all bread all month. 3 years ago, I was really struggling, and I began a medical journey that took a couple of years to get me onto a better, healthier path. I am grateful to have regained my health and to have learned so much about maintaining it. But I've also felt sort of a loss of innocence along the way. I no longer have an easy relationship with food. I now know that there are a bunch of foods that are not bad per se, but they are bad for me. Listening to the gospel we just heard, I find myself relating to Jesus contrasting the bread of life with the bread our ancestors ate. All I can say is one of them is gluten-free and the other isn't. I find myself longing for the freedom to be able to eat anything without having to make sure it doesn't have any of the ingredients that are bad for me. I long for the freedom to walk into any restaurant or anybody's home and eat whatever is being served, trusting the kindness and care those who invited me and those who prepared the food with love provided. At the same time, I have been moved to tears by the care and concern of friends and strangers alike who have gone out of their way to change the way they cook in order to prepare food that I can eat. I know that I am not the only one who has a complicated relationship with food. Just in these last few years, it's began to dawn on me that not everybody welcomes this month of readings about bread, and not just because it goes on and on and on, seems to be the same topic 4 weeks in a row, can't we get a break, but because it seems to paint this dualistic either or, Jesus's bread is good and everything else is bad kind of thing, when we have a much more complicated relationship to food. It's hard to imagine that talking about the bread of life as this unequivocally good thing could possibly be true. Here's the thing. Having a problem with food is different from having a problem with addiction, say with cigarettes or alcohol. While cigarettes and alcohol are attractive, people live healthy, happy lives without ever drinking or smoking at all, without never ever even having tried them, and yet they survive. Nobody lives without eating. Eating is good for you, except when it isn't. And until 3 years ago, I didn't know the second part of that sentence. Here's why I bring it up. A, some of you may be tired of the bread readings for the same reason I am. Wait a minute, this is complicated. And B, let's give it one last week today, because it turns out everything's complicated. Everything has its limits and its imperfections, its mixture of benefits and harms. Jesus, talking about the bread of life that will let us live forever, connects with this problem. We long for a life that is carefree. The bread that our ancestors ate, that's referenced by Jesus there, that was the manna that God gave from heaven when the Israelites were in the desert. It was already miraculous. Everything in this life is complicated. Everything in this life has benefits and harms. There are a few things at the extremes of the bell curve where either the benefits are hard to find or the harms are hard to find. But within the bounds of this mortal life, everything's part of life and everything ends in death. We long for a life that is carefree, but this complex, problematic life has in it freedom nonetheless. And paradoxically, it is not found by escaping the cares of life, but by caring. Not by rejecting the flesh, but by finding the spirit that is all mixed up with it. If that sentence in the middle of this gospel reading about where Jesus says, the Spirit gives life, the flesh itself is useless. He's not saying that there's an either-or choice there. Be spiritual, don't be fleshly. He's not saying that. The readers that followed after heard it that way because of other ways of looking at things, and that division has been brought into our own day, at least to some degree or another, just as long as people have been looking at these readings and thinking about them. But from Jesus' Jewish point of view, a person isn't a person without both flesh and spirit. Life isn't life without both flesh and spirit. It isn't that you have a body and you have a spirit. You have a spirit-filled body. You're both. And it's when we ignore part of what is there that the flesh becomes useless. It's when we forget that the Spirit, the life-giving Spirit, is there, and get preoccupied with the details and the particulars and the tweaks and the best and the most important and all of that stuff. All of those ways we can get hung up on some aspect of a thing, that we lose sight of what makes that thing life-giving. It's its wholeness. I found life, finally, after a couple of years of struggling, in eating food that is healthy for me. And I've done a lot of cooking and a lot of trying and a lot of testing and a lot of keeping charts and a lot of keeping lists and a lot of going to the grocery store and grabbing something and then reading the ingredients and putting it back, getting very hung up in the details and the particulars. That's not where I found the bread of life. I found it, as I mentioned earlier, when other people insisted on changing what they had planned in order to accommodate my special need. When Jesus said, "The flesh is not enough without the Spirit," people were stumped by the idea that getting it right wasn't what made it work. But doing it for the sake of others, moved by love, is what makes it the bread of life. These words that we hear from Jesus, remember, follow the miraculous feeding of 5,000 families, when they had 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and everybody said, "What do we do about this? We'd better send everybody away." And Jesus said, "You give them something to eat." It was the giving. It was the caring. It was the focus on each other, the relationships, the sharing, that made that bread the bread of life. And it does today. I may have already said it this summer, but Trinity is a community that understands communion through the lens of this miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. Of course, communion arose as a ritual by following the example that Jesus set the night before he died, Maundy Thursday, the night before Good Friday, the night before he was crucified. And there's a whole lot of meaning to be found in Jesus' willingness to sacrifice himself on the cross. There's a whole lot of meaning in communion that's found through thinking about Maundy Thursday and Good Friday. But there's also a whole lot to be found in gathering together and giving each other food. Just simply that. Just simply knowing that all of us need to eat to live. and that even if we give each other nothing but a little morsel that seems barely to be a symbolic meal and certainly not a physical meal, that it reminds us of the togetherness and the giving that are modeled on the love of God being the thing that moves everything in our lives and in our world. Amen.